But our first speaker, very appropriately, was Tenny's Western Armenian professor at UCLA, Hagop Gulludjian, who was the editor of the first edition of Tenny's poems. He's senior lecturer of Armenian studies in UCLA's Near Eastern Languages and Cultures department and the inaugural holder of the Kachigian Lectureship in Armenian Language and Culture. He holds a doctorate of letters and an MBA. He's researched and published on medieval Armenian poetry and diaspora and Armenian literature, heritage, language, and language vitality, as well as on interactions between virtuality, culture, and diasporas. He has an extensive background in publishing and IT, having co-founded Argentina's Internet2 Consortium, and having assisted both private and government entities on technology policy issues. And it's my pleasure to invite him to speak now.
Hello, thanks, Jesse. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Jesse and Josep, for organizing this event. Special thanks to Jesse for pursuing and achieving the second and more complete edition of Tenny Arlen's poetry. 2 days ago, on Thursday, I spent several hours at UCLA listening to the last batch of our students' final presentations of this academic term. As usual, they were encouraged to venture away from the concept of a traditional final paper and produce a creative work, or what I call a consumable language product. We do this within the framework of a creative literacy. Instead of attaining literacy through acquisition and learning of rules, almost never reaching a phase where students become palpably productive agents in the language, this experiment intends to invert the process and try to create first, share the love of creation and peer appreciation, and enter into a virtuous cycle that typically will lead to more reading and learning by habit, but most significantly, it may lead to an intense falling in love with the language and the creative experience. This long introduction is only to say that at least two of these terms' presentations dwelt at length on the work by Tenny Arlen, which they spontaneously, not my recommendation, chose as their subject, whereas another student demonstrated being inspired by Tenny's work in order to begin producing a book-length creative work himself. This just in one trimester. This is a demonstration of the power of shifting the paradigm from acquisitional literacy, which usually becomes preservational literacy, to creative literacy, or more precisely, to productive literacy. From what I say, you may end up having the impression that Tenny and her work were a product of this drive toward creative literacy. But the opposite is true, or also true. When Tenny began her studies, I had been experimenting with this approach for 7 or 8 years already, with some variations and more or less emphasis. But it was only after Tenny Arlen's journey in our classes that I made an effort to fit what I'd been observing in the outcome of these experiments into a theoretical framework to build a hypothesis and to try to demonstrate it methodically. It was then that, after several attempts to designate a name to this approach, the creative literacy label was adopted in 2016, just 1 year after Tenny's passing. So, even if Tenny studied under this general methodology, her very productive experience was that which became the main trigger or its further refinement, naming, and increasing theorization by myself and also by other researchers. One of them is here. She intends to write her dissertation on this, and she's very much inspired by Tenny's work. It seems that creative literacy as a method was instrumental in order to build an impact and start a small wave of language vitality, even among non-speakers. But it was not enough. It also needed individuals who would inspire us enough to make us dedicate hours and years of effort to build that further impact. Tenny's presence and creative genius not only catalyzed the crystallization of the concept of creative literacy, but it also motivated me to focus systematically on it and inspired me to pursue the creation 4 years later of the course/workshop series Language in Action. Since then, in its several iterations, the series has produced more than 2,000 short pieces and about 200 long pieces of creative language products. This is what I would call real impact, well beyond the value of academic journals' impact scores or impact factors. Tenny Arlen's life and creation are at the basis, at the core of this authentic, continuing, palpable, and transformative impact. The same way as creative literacy was not a chance occurrence, Tenny Arlen's work was no product of random inspiration, nor a deceptive case of producing beauty in a language even before she was able to speak in it. I have personally observed and witnessed all her steps from the beginning, before knowing the alphabet, up to her writing and creating at times in my presence. In 2015, I met one of her roommates who had come from San Francisco. She approached me and said, "I have no idea what Armenian is, but I came to say hello because I'm interested in why Tenny was so absorbed in her Armenian texts and classes. Wherever we went, no matter what program we had on Saturday night or weekends, she would stay in the room poring over Armenian books and her notebooks." This testimony points toward Tenny's unusual commitment, a commitment derived from being in love with artistic creation, poetry, and language. Jesse asked each of us to read 2 pieces from the book. I read the question of the Armenian language and poet. Unfortunately, I almost won't read them in Armenian, even though this is all about Armenian because of time constraints. You can buy the book and read them yourselves. I will contextualize their genesis. Susan Barba wished for someone to read also Soul on page 133. I will only refer to it. Tenny wrote all of these 3 pieces during the first 3 weeks of February 2013, within the context of a 5-week seminar mostly dedicated to Daniel Varuzhan's poetics and his understanding of aesthetics in pagan songs from 1912. It opened with a reading of a discussion by Kant of the soul, which he defined, in the aesthetic sense, of course, as the animating principle of the mind. For our class, it was meant to deconstruct the nationalistic abuse of what Armenians call national sorrow spirit in poetry, and to suggest Varuzhan's predominant use of the concept in the purely aesthetic domain. That week's prompt to write was, "Where is the soul?" And Tenny opened her text with, quote, "Not what is the soul, but where is the soul? The soul is everywhere." And continued, "Each beautiful thing lasts, and each beautiful thing wants to reach another world. Our actions search for meaning in a higher and absolute realm. From every word of poetry, from each genuine action, from each leaf, the soul attains existence." End of quote. The text, which she read from Kant in Armenian translation, obviously, and that was one of the hard things for her to do, was about the critique of taste, which tries to understand or explain how an artist expresses genius. That is, how the artist inspires a soul into her creation. In other words, how she connects rational ideas and representations of the imagination in a way that can awaken in us the feeling of facing something beautiful. If we can have now that kind of experience when reading Tenny Arlen's writings, it means that she was able to breathe the soul or spirit into the clay of words she worked on. That ability is not possible to explain or rationalize. It is not something we can learn at school. Studies may refine its expression, may channel or pave the way for its manifestation, but it is the writer, the individual, who supplies its essence, and there lies Tenny Arlen's genius. The piece titled "The Question of the Armenian Language, Hailezvi Khantire," was a response to an article with the same title by Varuzhan 100 years earlier. Tenny produced a very short but extraordinarily powerful text. It has been more influential on my students than many lengthy scholarly articles on the subject. It essentially foregrounds the need to open language to real life instead of preserving it as a sacred object to be revered in ritualistic routines. It was so compelling that one of its sentences gave the book its title, Կիրքով ըսելու ինչո. So the question of the Armenian language, in Tenny's words, the Armenian language survived for many years. Its existence was threatened, its home was shattered, but it lived. The Armenian language, like the erratic wind, traveled through mountains, by rivers, on oceans. Now it lives in different monasteries, in the city, in the village, on the farm. But for what? To say house, meal, mother, father, kitchen? Or to say nature, the mother who gave me life? To say with passion, why am I here? That contagious passion is, in part, responsible for the production of hundreds of new works in the Language in Action series that bring continued vitality to the language. So far, with about 200 participants having the opportunity to recategorize their relationship with the language, switching from the role of acquirer preserver to that of user creator or consumer producer. In other words, the conscious shift toward the experience of a living language, but more importantly, to the experience of self-actualization to language, playing with it, wrestling, flirting, making love with it. In the words of the title of this book, saying with passion, why am I here? Tenny clearly formulated here what for her was the utility of language while highlighting the key to its vitality. In this, her work is a call to Armenian cultural and even literary institutions and scholars to end the growing discrimination against, or even the outright proscription of, the Armenian language and its literary practitioners. The other piece I'll read is entitled Poet on page 129. Its original title responded to the prompt Poet, God, Creation, after discussing in the work by Varujan and his junior fellow poet Aharon the idea and drive toward poetic theosis or divinization through poetic creation, and discussing Derrida's anthropo-theological mimesis. In this view, the poet does not imitate nature in his creation, but imitates God's creation of nature. I quote Tenny's text. God created the world not for any hidden motive or reason, but only for creation. The true poet is similar. She writes not because of a need to promote anything or anyone, but the poet writes for the sake of creation, because in this world filled with hate, fear, murder, and destruction, creation is good, creation is healing, creation is indispensable. God did not create for a rational reason, and similarly, the poet wants to escape life's rational, constructed understandings that the world gives to her. To write poetry only for the purpose of creation is to look through the soul. To want to write a poem because the soul has a need for it is to be like God. End of Tenny's quote. These pieces are brief and they seem austere and simple. However, as explained through the context that I provided about the underlying text and ideas, we can see that many of Tenny's simple sentences condense deep philosophical and aesthetic ideas. As one of my students mentioned on Thursday, her words possess a brilliant ability to consolidate into a beautiful poem such profound meaning in simple terms. These ideas of poetic divinization discussed in the study of Varujan, where true creation becomes attainable only through the imitation of the divine function, we're going to connect later with the study of Saint Grigor Narekatsi. Here, after considering the medieval poet's effort to communicate with God through God's own language of creation, Tenny produced, with cuts from newspapers and handwritten text, a collage that was to contain only words by Naregatsi. It is on page 12, Roman numbering, the book. I'll finish with a translation of its words. They are revealing and so full of potentiality. There's a title, to write, grel. Then we find words scattered along the page. Oh Lord, there. Vitality, gentanutun, unrestrained, anchapan. Shall I see? Bididesnem. And then, ornvad hastichem, that is, I'm a blessed hastich. That's a word that means both creator, maker, author, producer. Her words say, though, I won't add anything else. Thank you very much.